Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy
the interview.
And today we are joined by the member for Ringwood, Will Fowles. Will, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Just for our audience out there, Will, who may not know an entire lot about you, could you give us a little brief description of yourself just before we get into the questions?
Sure. I'm 46 years old, I think. No, almost 46 years old. I have been a member of parliament for 6 years. I'm married. I've got 4 kids. I live in Ringwood, and I've been I was first the member for Burwood for 4 years, and I've been the member for Ringwood for the last 2.
Interesting there. And, that was a big redistribution, I remember, back in 2022, with, a lot of shifts in the eastern suburb seat. So you found yourself out in Ringwood afterwards.
Yeah, well, I get fortunately or unfortunately, basically the Burwood seat was abolished, which was the seat that I represented. I had a preference, as most MPs do, to stand for the seat that they are currently in if they're seeking re-election. That unfortunately was an opportunity that wasn't made available to me. About half of my seat got merged into the Box Hill seat, and they already had a great Labor member in Paul Hamer. And then the other half of the seat was sort of merged with Mount Waverley to create the new seat of Ashwood. And the member there, Matt Freegan, obviously had an equal size claim, I guess, if you like, to being the candidate for that seat. It didn't come to there was no sort of pre-selection stoush. We were very fortunate that circumstances meant that Dustin House stepped down, and I was happy to take up the challenge of securing Ringwood, which we did with a healthy 3+% point swing in.
Yeah. So I guess that's, a little bit of a backstory there, shifting from Burwood to Ringwood. I mean, it's not too far of a shift, but it's still a considerable shift. But as you said now, previously before the interview study, you've been getting a lot of connections in the Ringwood area, talking to a lot of locals, talking to a lot of primary schools. So it must be really good, to have a different sort of sense of community coming from Burwood to Ringwood. But I do guess most of the community is quite similar.
Look, I think in particular the western part of my seat, which is the Mitcham, Nunawading, Blackburn, Vermont part of the seat, is really very similar to most of the Burwood seat. Probably some of the differences are that Burwood had quite a large public housing area in the Ashwood area, and that isn't as apparent in this seat. And the eastern part of the seat, particularly Heathmont, Ringwood East, Ringwood, is probably significantly less denser, I guess, than most of the Burwood seat. And so for that reason, with the population further spread out, you've got some different moving parts, some different demands on the infrastructure, and I guess some different approaches to the way people go about their daily lives.
For sure. So I think we'll get straight into the questions here, Will. So my first question to you is, how was your high school and university life? And do you have any memorable moments?
Oh, look, plenty of memorable moments, I guess, particularly from university. I was very involved, very involved at university, a member of a ton of clubs, sat on the exec or on the committees of a bunch of clubs, and became, I guess, engaged in what was happening in the Monash Student Association or the student union. Got very involved there, I guess, probably mainly by the student newspaper, and it was throughout my involvement in that and getting more engaged with what was happening in the student association that I ultimately realised that my value set aligned with that of the students who were in the Monash Labor Club, the Monash ALP Club. And in time, I resolved that I wanted to take a bigger role in that. And in 1999, I was fortunate enough to be pre-selected and then ultimately successful in that year in the general election to become president of the Monash Student Association, a role that lasted for calendar year 2000. We had a bit to do. The year started, of course, with what you may know from your reading, perhaps rather than personal experience, a thing called the Millennium Bug. So there was a lot of preparation that went into that. But then one of the other significant pieces of work that happened in that year was the implementation of the goods and services tax, which commenced on the 1st of July in that year. So between that and a whole bunch of other reforms, some changes to the Constitution, some changes in the way in which we dealt with the student body, it was a very busy but fulfilling year in 2000. And that certainly ranks as not just one of my highlights of university, but indeed one of the highlights of my life.
And were there a lot of things that you learned from your university career that you kind of used towards you know your more corporate career, as we're going to talk a little bit more down the line, but were there some of the similarities there?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think university generally prepares people pretty well for the demands of being an employee in an organisational environment, whether that's in the not-for-profit sector, whether it's for government, or indeed whether it's in the private sector. But I think what's really important, and if I have a concern, it's this: that what happens outside of the lecture theatre really matters as well. It's important that we make sure that we continue to have opportunities for students to get involved in the extracurricular life that has always traditionally been a large feature of life on campus. And as I say, I have a bit of a concern that modern economic pressures are undermining that a bit. But from my perspective anyway, I learned, I think, just as much outside the classroom as I did inside it, learning about politics, about organisations, about campaigns, about the way in which you enliven and enrich communities. And that has been a feature of my life ever since.
Yeah, those sort of people skills are stuff that you can never really learn in lecture theatres and classrooms. And, actually interacting with groups and communities is really, really important to further those sort of skills.
Correct.
Yeah. We'll move on to our next question then, Will. So this relates more to your time in the corporate sector. So prior to Parliament, Will, you worked in some corporate firms, including Unilever and the Scarborough Capital. How did your work in these corporate firms prepare you for your career in Parliament?
Yeah, look, they were very different roles in very different organisations. Scarborough Capital was quite small. It was a niche finance business that was really working in the investment universe on a very bespoke basis. Unilever was almost the opposite of that. It was an absolutely massive business responsible for brands you'd recognise like Meadowlee and Rexona and Dove and Lynx and a huge portfolio of products, Streets ice creams. A huge portfolio and a massive organisation, but I think at that time was turning in excess of $1 billion a year in Australia. So they were very, very different. But I think what you get from those first employment experiences is an understanding of how people work and think, but also about the importance of having a clearly enunciated strategy for any organisation. And I think if there's one thing I've taken away from those two very different workplaces, it's the impact of having a clearly defined strategy and how that correlated to the success or otherwise of those organisations. Both jobs gave me the opportunity to do some travel, to understand a bit about the wider world, and I was very fortunate, I guess, in both of those roles to quite often being the youngest person in the room, but enjoying very much the opportunity to learn from people who've been doing it a lot longer.
And how long did you actually work at these two different corporate firms? Is it over a span of a decade, or? And I'm guessing
no, I think I had about 18 months with Unilever and about 3 years or so, I think, with Scarborough Capital before I went out on my own.
Okay. So that was, that was probably straight after university. So it's really good to build that sort of experience, in those sort of big firms, especially as you were saying, Unilever, which, has a lot of products that, pretty recognizable, like Rexona and street foods, as you said. So I guess that sort of experience, especially in those big firms, can really help you down the line when, if you go further on and set up your own sort of businesses as you've done previously, Will.
Yeah, so there's sort of two things you leave, three things really, you would leave any role with. One is a reputation, and I would always encourage people to invest in their reputation, their personal brand. That is a very important part of your ability to find your next role, your next exciting adventure. you will leave with a network and you will leave with some skills and experience. And I think it's important to invest in all of those things. Invest in your own brand or your reputation, invest in the skills and experience, but also invest in the network that you're building in any role that you have, because it's amazing how often I find myself picking up the phone 5, 10, 15, even 20 years later and getting in touch with people I've worked with in the past to ask them about a particular problem or ask them for a perspective on a particular issue.
And those sort of connections you make back in your previous career can really help you in terms of politics, because as we've talked about previously, politics is all about making connections and talking to community leaders. And in that sense, that sort of corporate firm connections that you can build in your previous career can really help you in furthering those sort of issues that might not be talked much about, in the wider scheme of politics.
Completely agree.
Yeah. We'll move on to our next question for you, Will. So, in addition to your work in Unilever and Scarborough Capital, you also started up your own business called Piper Capital, which managed portfolios including Food and Wine Co. in Melbourne and the Heritage Hotel in Rockhampton, Queensland. After this, you then founded another company, Piper Communications, which provided strategic communications advice and advocacy for commercial and not-for-profit clients. It is quite interesting that a former Labor MP started his own small businesses. So my question to you is, in your opinion, how important are small businesses to the Australian economy and the Victorian economy?
Oh, small business is absolutely a critical feature of the Australian economy. The Australian economy, I think, is organised a little bit differently to some other economies of the world. I mean, for example, in Germany, their real focus is on mid-sized companies, so companies of 100 to 500 employees, of which there are thousands in Germany. The Australian economy is a little bit different because of our bias towards resources, where you tend to have massive businesses involved, and also because of the challenge of geography. It is far more challenging to open up a branch office in Sydney if you're based in Melbourne than it is to open up a branch office in Bonn if you're based in Berlin. Just the sheer size of the geography makes that really challenging, particularly when you get to a jurisdiction like Queensland. I think what is often not well understood by people who live in the southern part of the country, as we do, is that the distance from Brisbane to Melbourne is to within 3 kilometres, exactly the same distance as the distance from Brisbane to Cairns. Queensland is absolutely enormous, and
It's
the
massive.
ability to service jurisdictions like that with a mid-sized business is quite difficult. You can do it with very large businesses, Coles, Woolworths, BHP, or what you tend to have is geographically bound small businesses, and that's prevalent right across the Australian economy. And it doesn't matter whether you're a business that services multiple jurisdictions or not. The reality is that the economy is sort of built around the prevalence of small businesses, and they are absolutely critical to economic growth and to the success of the Australian economy, no doubt.
And just talking a little bit about your time setting up those sort of businesses, were there any sort of legalities or issues that you found when you were setting them up back in your time? Probably, I'm guessing you set these up about 10, 15 years ago. So were there any real challenges that you found?
So the first one was 2006, so it's going back a while ago,
Okay.
nearly 20 years ago now. But look, every time I've set up a business, I've sworn I'd never do it again, and then invariably have, because it is so much work. The foundational piece, and I think there's probably a strong argument, a public policy argument to be made for making that process easier than it is at the moment. But there are always things you simply cannot anticipate. It's not as easy as fill in a form and come up with a brand and a logo and away you go. Like, there are just so many moving parts, and some of those things can be really frustrating. Even the matter of getting internet connected to a premises or signing a lease, or those things,
such small things.
Yeah, they sound sort of trite or little, but they're actually really complicated. I mean, I remember at one point I was searching for a new office, and in the end, you invest a huge amount of time into that. And once you've got it, great, you're all up and running. But in the meantime, you're not focusing on the business of your business. You're focusing on the support system or the ecosystem in which your business is established, and that can be frustrating because, and obviously, they aren't revenue items. When you employ someone, or secure office space, or get the internet connected, or sort out your company car, or fill in your tax form, none of those things generate revenue. None of them. In fact, most of them generate expense. So I think there's probably an argument in Australia to make that process a little bit easier. But also, I think it's important for anyone starting a new business to understand that you do have to invest a fair bit into getting to the start line. That you don't get to go into business and go, hooray, we're here, off we go, we're going to start writing revenue. In fact, it's a fair bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of trial and tribulation, in the first couple of years of starting a business. If you don't have that sort of brand and that sort of, recognition, before you start, it's quite hard to build that sort of thing up. And, it can take 5 to 6 years, even a decade for, the fruits of your for your effort to come through.
Sure. I mean, there are some people who get very fortunate and build their businesses rapidly early. Most people, though, find the experience is more one of grind for 5 or 10 years, and then you get an outcome or an exit. My journey's had a bit of both in it. We've had some successes on the way through, and some things that have proven to be more difficult, and ultimately some businesses that have failed. But that's part of the entrepreneurial journey. But that's a journey that stopped for me in 2018 when I decided to move into the Victorian Parliament.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get on to that, sort of talking about what made you run in Parliament. But we do have another question we're going to ask you a bit around, some sort of policy sense. So Will, interestingly, you are a staunch Republican, serving as the national youth convener of the Australian Republican movement at the age of 23, and being involved in the movement up until your election. Why is it important to you that Australia becomes a republic? And what are some of the barriers that we are currently facing for this to happen?
Sure. Look, I think Australians' egalitarianism is at profound odds with a system of government that features a foreign monarch. We all know that when Prince William is at the Commonwealth Games barracking for England, that reflects his true sentiment. And yet, at some point, he'll become king and be expected to barrack for all of the Commonwealth. We know where their loyalties lie. We know where they live. We know what their biases are. They are perhaps a good model for Great Britain. That's a judgment for Britons to make. But I don't think that the monarchy is a good model for Australia. I think we are mature enough to stand on our own 2 feet, and we ought trust enough in ourselves to design a system that allows us to reflect democratically what sort of head of state we would like, and to make sure that we project that sense of independence and strength to the rest of the world. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with the idea of having a Commonwealth of nations. Indeed, there are many republics inside the Commonwealth. But I think it is really, really important that nations, mature nations that have the ability, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Canada, also have the opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet and become republics with an Indigenous head of state.
Mm-hmm. And that's quite interesting that you talk about that, because there's a lot of trial and tribulation right now around the Republican movement. As we saw in Barbados, I think about 2-3 years ago, they overwhelmingly supported a republic. And I guess in a sense, Australia is changing, and there's that sort of monarchy base in Australia is really around that sort of English descent of the population. And with a lot of new migrants coming into the country, a lot of them don't have that sort of connection to the UK as we once did, maybe 100, 200 years ago. So that sort of change in the mood of the electorate could, favor the Republican movement. And I myself as well is a Republican. So hopefully, down the line we could see some change.
Look, I would absolutely love to see that change. I think of the tragedies that came out of the Voice referendum, and there are a number of them. One of them is that there will be now, I think, a degree of constitutional timidity. That is, I think there will be a reluctance from elected leaders to go to be adventurous in their thinking about Australia's constitutional makeup. We know that the constitutional test, the test you need to clear to change the constitution in Australia, isn't just a majority of voters. It's a majority of voters in a majority of states. Particularly Queensland and the West have always been more conservative jurisdictions. And I think our challenge is to persuade them of the merits of moving to a model that is ultimately about us and not about another system of government. I know that the traditions are important to many, and I think the British traditions in Australia, the institutions, Westminster system, parliamentary democracy, judicial system, separation of church and state, separation of powers. These are all fundamental parts of Australia's system of governance. And we aren't talking about tearing that up. What we're talking about is embellishing, improving, and owning that structure, but doing it in a way that better reflects the aspirations of Australians, now whom, of course, a majority don't have anything like that same sense of loyalty or tie to Britain that they might have had 20, 40, 80, or indeed back when the Federation was founded 124 years ago.
Yeah, and just talking about how the Republican, referendum could happen. I remember back in 1999 there was a little bit of tribulation in the Republican side about how an actual president would be elected in that sense. Some people were talking about it being appointed via Parliament. Some people were talking about it actually being democratically elected. Where do you sit on that sort of proposal?
Look, I made my position public in 2003 that I thought that there was a number of positions on the constitutional spectrum or the Republican spectrum that were ultimately going to be safe and constitutionally achievable. I supported the model in 1999, that being the president being chosen by an absolute 2/3 majority of a joint sitting of Parliament. I still think that is a model with a great deal of benefit. Excuse me.
All good.
But what was apparent to me as part of that campaign is that it was pretty easy for the monarchists to disingenuously sell this idea that created the politicians' republic. In fact, it's the opposite. In fact, that if you force politicians into a room to agree on a consensus candidate, I guarantee you it won't be a politician. But nonetheless, that was the argument. I think it is the case, and I do support Australians wanting to have direct buy-in to their president. There is, of course, a fear about an alternate mandate, but I think that is addressed, frankly, my personal view, is to have a directly elected president, but have that president be absolutely powerless. That is, ultimately, at the end of the day, or almost powerless, perhaps. At the end of the day, it's the Prime Minister of a properly constituted Parliament under our traditions, who is the head of the government, and you simply have a president who is the head of state. That is a role that is largely ceremonial. Might have some particular constitutional roles in a formal sense, but nothing like, for example, the American model where the head of government is also the head of state. In terms of how do you get to that directly elected president? Again, my personal view, and I guess this is something of a hybridised model. I would prefer that the direct election be from Parliament's list. That is, we don't just have free for all. If you get 100,000 signatures, you get to nominate, and away you go. You're a candidate for Australian president. I would rather that Parliament get together and form a view about the sort of people they would like to see in that role. Obviously, have some engagement around that. Obviously, have a public process to put names forward. But at the end of the day, make sure that appearing on the ballot is 5, 6, or perhaps 7 choices, and allowing Australians to form a view directly about who they want as the leader of their nation when presenting our face to the world.
And I think that's a very sensible model, and a model that a lot of Australians would support as well. And agreeing with that fact, we don't want a sort of American model where the president is the head of state and the head of government. I think that more ceremonial role, kind of very similar to what you see in some European countries, and even in India, where their president's a more ceremonial role as well. It'd be a much better system than having the president being head of state and the head of government. I totally agree with that. So yeah, we'll move on to our next question for you, Will. So, talking a little bit about political role models and idol, who would you say would be your political role model or idol?
Look, there are a few. I always admired, though I wasn't alive at the time, but I've admired the things that Gough Whitlam achieved in his term of government. In fact, I'll just he's on the wall behind me there, and also on the wall behind me there is
Steve Bracks.
Steve Bracks, who I think it's important, that you don't have role models who are simply those who are exactly what you would project as, the perfection or the greatest leader or whatever, that you have role models that might offer some balance to the way in which you go about things. I thought Steve was a deeply principled leader. He's a gem of a bloke, but he's a deeply principled leader. And his style of going about it, I think I've learned a lot from, because I'm probably instinctively a bit more inclined to sort of lay out a vision and then kind of crack the whip and get everyone jumping along to whatever that vision is. I think Steve's style, very consultative, very inclusive, and I've learned from him the importance of making sure that you take people on a journey with you rather than simply expecting people to fall in line. I think, frankly, Daniel Andrews could have learned a bit more from Steve in that regard.
Yeah, and I think in general, that sort of consultative way of talking to your MPs and really listening to them is important more than that sort of autocratic style. I'm in charge. The big dog in charge kind of thing. It's a bit too it's a bit too autocratic, and I think a lot of people can see through that sort of thing. And I'm just talking about Steve Braxton. Do you have a personal relationship as well with Steve? Are you still in contact with him?
Yeah, no. Steve is as I say, a delightful bloke. He's a Geelong supporter, can't help that. But his wife Terry, also a fantastic person, is a Melbourne supporter like me, and so we've had plenty of terrific days together at the football over the journey.
That's great. That's great to hear. So, I mean, and I guess as well as you said, you don't really want to have that sort of one political role model where you base your whole political career off. I think it's important to really space it out and try and have multiple you try and emulate, because at the end of the day, not every single politician is perfect and everyone has their own flaws and mistakes. So you don't want to try and become a politician of the past as well, because at the end of the day, they might have been good in the 70s and 80s, but their sort of views may not reflect Australia, in the 21st century.
Yeah, indeed. And I guess I'll probably add to my list Paul Keating, because of his ability to think far beyond the life of his government. He was trying to do things that were genuinely intergenerational, long-term things. He wasn't successful in all of it, and plenty of people can have picked over the entrails of his career to determine strategic errors in the way he went about it. But his ability to articulate a vision for our reconciliation with Indigenous Australians, his ability to articulate a vision around the Republic, genuinely inspirational stuff, and a big part of the reason why I fell ultimately into the Labor camp.
Yeah, and we'll now move on to our next question for you, Will. So, what made you run in the 2018 state election? Sorry, for the Labor Party, and what made you join the Labor Party? I mean, you briefly talked a little bit about why you joined the Labor Party at university, but if you could give us a little bit more detail, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. Look, joining the Labor Party was an easy decision for me because I had spent a lot of time with students from across the political spectrum at Monash University, and it was just very clear to me that my value set, the way I saw things, the way I went about things, was completely consistent with the way those Labor students went about things, and ultimately consistent with the values of the Labor Party, a party of which I'm still a member, even though I now sit on the crossbench. So joining the ALP was the easy bit. Sticking fat with the ALP over the last 25 years hasn't always been easy, because there have been positions the party has taken that I have disagreed with. But the difference between the Labor Party and other parties is that as a party of government, you necessarily have to have a broad church, and you will have internal disagreements. And I think Labor has struck the right balance in moderating those disagreements. It doesn't all happen behind closed doors. We have conferences that are open to observers, members of the public, unlike the Greens, for example, who conduct their conferences behind closed doors. But we also have those debates and have proper debates in public, which I think is a bit different to perhaps some of the coalition parties who tend to resolve all the issues and then present this sort of false united front once we get to their respective conference floors. And I think so joining Labor for those reasons, easy. Staying with Labor at times hard, but as I say, I'm still a member of the party. Probably my faith in the party has been challenged as much as it ever has been in the past 12 months because of the way I've been treated, and by people not respecting the rule of law and respecting processes that have been put in place to determine the truth or otherwise of allegations. But I've been very fortunate over the 25 years, I think, to have had plenty of fellow travellers inside the Labor tent. So I think overall it's been a good decision. Sorry, in terms of 2018, look, the opportunity was there. I was at a point in my career where, in 2018 I was 40 years old. that's probably about the time, for most
You
where
consider
you consider entering politics. And it's been a hell of a journey over the last 6 years. But we put together a terrific insurgent campaign in 2018. We had no support. It wasn't a target seat. We had to fundraise the money ourselves. We had to put the campaign on the ground ourselves without any assistance really from our immediate community, our immediate network. And ultimately, the 7.5% swing to Labor in the 2018 election in Burwood spoke volumes for what an amazing effort was put on the ground by all the people, all the volunteers who contributed.
And those sort of grassroots campaigns, especially during that time, would have been very, very crucial in towards your political campaign as well. Connecting with the community is so crucial, as we've spoken immensely in this interview about, that sort of connections are crucial. And, when you build those connections up at the start of your political career, they'll normally last for quite a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, look, I think 2018 was a really tough campaign, but that's what campaigns should be. They should be hard work. You should have to work hard to win the trust of your community. 2022 was an awful campaign because of all of the participants who hadn't historically been participants in these processes, the hard right, the nutters, the cookers, all of the anti-vaxxers, all of these very negative, divisive, hard right, populist voices, and a level of conduct that I've simply never seen or hadn't seen prior to 2022. Just truly disgusting behaviour from so many of those people who are probably newer to the political process, but nonetheless utterly disrespectful of the democratic traditions and norms that we have enjoyed for so long in Australia.
Yeah, and those sort of they did gain some sort of support, in the western northern suburbs, but as we saw previously, didn't pick up any seats and anything because that sort of movement was kind of quashed, specifically in 2022. And I'm guessing as well,
classic example, I think, where you had a really noisy minority. They were definitely dominating right throughout the pandemic and into the run in the 2022 election. They comfortably accounted for 50% of the noise, the media volume, the letters, the comments, the social media, comfortably 50%. But in reality, at the end of the day, they represented a very small section of our community, a small section of the community who I don't begrudge, who are perhaps validly disaffected with things that have gone on inside government or in the major parties, but who are stoked along by people who are working to a very bad agenda, and in some respects, an evil agenda.
And specifically as well, a lot of the campaigning, very negative campaigns towards Dan Andrews specifically as well. You saw the party, I think there was a party called Sack Dan Andrews Party as well. There were a lot of Freedom Party as well, a lot of these different sort of political parties were really only there just to stoke fear into the community, which was quite upsetting in that period of time when, you wanted stability and you wanted, a fair government after, 2-3 years of heartache. And these people come into the election and really try and stoke fear into the community about, what some candidates could do. And, it was all just a big kerfuffle that period of time.
Look,
and especially as a young person as well. Yeah, as you were saying.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was an extraordinary period of time, I hope to never have to suffer through again, although I think some of the epidemiological science would tell you that there are some risks around a future pandemic, and it's likely to happen sooner rather than later. But it was a period of time that was absolutely extraordinary in the very literal sense of that word. And government was up in people's faces and controlling so much of what was going on in a way that Australians were profoundly unused to. There are plenty of places in the world where that degree of government intervention into your daily life is par for the course. But it jolted the sensibilities of Australians, but it jolted them in different ways. And I think at the end of the day, it was the quiet majority who said, look, this is awful, this is hard, we don't like it, but it's the right thing to do. I had a lot of people telling me that, that we were just engaging in things like lockdowns as some sort of power trip. And I reminded them, and I'm happy to remind anybody watching this podcast, that fundamentally political agency is derived, at least to some degree, from popularity. That is, your agency is derived from having said you're going to do some stuff and then getting on and doing it. And no politician is going to do something fundamentally unpopular, like locking people up in their own houses, unless they're
Because
doing
to
it for a
save
really
people.
good reason. It just doesn't make any political sense to go down a path as draconian as the path that we did go down, unless you absolutely had to do it. You felt that there was just simply no alternative. And that's the position the Victorian government found itself in. That's the position governments right around the world found themselves in. And ultimately, we had less death and destruction as a result of the pandemic, directly as a result of the actions we took.
And we're into our last question. So, Will, finally, what's one piece of advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially those who are studying university or high school?
Yeah, well, I'll give the same piece of advice I've been giving pretty consistently for the last 20 years, which is take a risk. Take a risk. There, you have way more time on your side than it can feel like when you're in the middle of a Year 12 exam or starting high school or starting university. You feel like you've got this urgency and this need to, do this and conform to that and get your process done, get your ATAR, get into the course, get the course finished, get a job, all that sort of stuff. You've actually got way more time on your side than you know. And taking a risk, going and, working for Médecins Sans Frontières or going and hiking in the Appalachians or going and working at a school in Cambodia, it doesn't matter what it is, take that risk, back yourself in to do something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, and you'll find that that experience will contribute so much more to the balance of your career than an additional year on the treadmill, as a lawyer or an accountant or even as a politician. These are the things that bring colour and enrichment to our lives. And I would just encourage all of your listeners, viewers, to take that chance on doing something that's a little bit out there, because ultimately they can become the defining decisions of your life.
Mm-hmm. And, if you don't take risks in your life, you might not be able to progress as much as possible in your career and that sort of thing. And, no one's really stopping you from taking those risks. It's really only yourself. So at the end of the day, there's no harm in trying something. There's no harm in pushing yourself because there's not really much to lose. If you take a risk and, you fail, you'll still end up, you might be a little bit worse off, but you still end up in a decent position. So it's always worth taking those risks and pushing yourself to the limit.
Yeah. And if you find anyone you're even remotely interested in, ask them for work experience. The worst thing that can happen is they say no, but you'd be surprised. You can roll up to Supreme Court judges, prime ministers, circus clowns, acrobats, AFL footballers, AFL coaches. It doesn't matter. If you say, hey, can I just come and follow you around for a few days, particularly, if you're at high school and in university, overwhelmingly people will say yes, and you will learn a ton from those experiences.
Exactly. And I'm guessing a lot of people have, in university and high school have contacted you, Will, about, work experience and
Absolutely.
you're working in the office. So, I'm glad if you're accepting them in and, giving them sort of those sort of
100%.
opportunities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So those are all our questions for you, Will. I do really appreciate you coming on the podcast and speaking to us. One of the only Labor sort of MPs have talked to us. So I do really appreciate you coming on and speaking to us about your career before politics and some advice you'd give to students.
My absolute pleasure. I wish all of your viewers the very best with their journey through life, but in particular, through those wonderful years at university.
Yeah. All right. Thank you again, Will. Thank you very much.